Hello, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of The Crossroads. Actually, thank you for coming back because I did take myself a little bit of a break, girl, because I needed a break. Okay, so I took one, and now I'm back, and so are you, and I'm so glad. Anywho, I'm your host, Rashida Green, and this is the show for and about environmental justice and those who fight the fight with skin as melanated as the days are long. Knowledge is power, and we are breaking down the stereotypes one episode at a time. Okay, so I said it before and I'll say it again. I'm back from a decent enough hiatus, and now we're going to get back to business. So we are, as I mentioned in the last episode I put out, which seems like eons ago, we're actually going to be talking about a subject matter that is very near and dear to my heart, which is actually horror, and it's my favorite, and I love it. But before we get there, we're going to give some flowers. I am giving flowers to a few people today because it's been a while, and I'm recording this. I mean, honestly, we're less than 2 weeks into this new year, and my Lord, I mean, can we just pull the car over just very briefly to talk about all the foolishness that's going on? I mean, we will, because I'm probably going to just randomly have an outburst. But anywho, to the point, giving flowers to a few people today. And actually, the first person that I want to give some flowers to, someone that I really loved, I really admired his music. And now we found out that we lost a really great rapper, a personal favorite of mine, MF Doom. So I'm giving him some flowers today because his music meant a lot to me. His style meant a lot to me. And it's so auspicious that, we found out about his passing, but that he actually died on Halloween. Just the irony and the heartbreak all at the same time. So I'm actually going to dedicate this episode to his memory. Not for anything in particular of the subject matter, except just like he was an amazing rapper. He had a very authentic style. And for those who know who he is, or maybe you don't, if you know Metal Face Doom, the actual comic book villain, you know that he wore a mask. And so did MF Doom, the rapper. So I'm giving some flowers to him. Hoe Cakes is like the best song ever. And another person I want to give some flowers to, who I've actually had the pleasure of meeting a couple of times, is actually the literary baddie Tananarive Due. That's right, Tananarive Due. Say that 4 times fast. So Tananarive the Stallion is an author. She is a film scholar. If any of you are familiar with her works, then you might know that she's been in a couple of documentaries talking about horror. Specifically, there's one on the Shudder channel. Shout out to the Shudder channel. Oh my goodness. But there's actually a really great documentary called Horror Noir, which is based on a book of the same title that actually goes into very great detail discussing the Black experience in horror as actors, as directors, etc., and the messages that have come out of it. So as I mentioned in the last episode, I decided that I wanted to do some research about, based on this essay that I read. And it actually got me thinking. So the title of the essay is called Ideological Formations of the Nuclear Family in the Hills Have Eyes. Okay. And it's by a woman named Lorena Russell. It's part of a collection of essays on horror entitled The Philosophy of Horror. And if you are nerdy like me, which I think you might be, I would definitely recommend reading it. Now, I'm taking bits and pieces from this essay because it's really focusing more so on ideology, which is not the perspective of this episode, of course. Obviously, we're going to be talking about even more awesome stuff like nuclear testing, which is actually the subject of this particular episode right here. So in this particular essay, Lorena explores how there's 2 films. If you guys, hopefully you all know, but if you do not, That's all right. So there are two versions of the film, The Hills Have Eyes. There was one that came out in the 1970s that was produced by Wes Craven. And then there was another one in the early 2000s, and I believe 2008. And pretty much the movies are about the same as far as plot, what happens, how this very lily white family takes a wrong turn and ends up in the desert and then is pretty much overwhelmed by a family of, folk that, they cannibals, girl. They out there in the hills and such. And they not only do the hills have eyes, they also have empty stomachs. Okay, so this family living in these hills attack this poor lily white cherry pie eating family, and they got to fight to survive. The only difference between these two movies is at the beginning of the 2008 version, they have a disclaimer, which states that there was nuclear testing that occurred in the United States in the 1950s and 60s. And I said, oh, saith what? And so quite naturally, your girl got to Googling, and I found a whole bunch of shit. Okay. So the subject of this first part, this is going to be a two-parter. So we're going to be talking about nuclear testing in the US, specifically the Nevada Proving Ground. And in a follow-up episode, I'm also going to be talking about the nuclear testing in the Marshall Islands. So that's going to be part 2. So now that we've kind of set the framework a little bit, let's just get straight into this business, okay? So let's talk about the timeline so we can set the stage here. So we're really talking about the Cold War. And the Cold War started around 1945 and lasted until December 2nd, 1989. This is basically just a giant pissing match between the U.S. and Russia, formerly was called the USSR, and allies as well. There were other folks, not just U.S. and Russia. There were other folks involved in the nuclear testing efforts, and we will cover them very shortly. So there was a lot happening during this very long period from 1945 to 1989. A couple wars, we're coming in after 1945. We've already finished closed the chapter on World War II, but we not too long afterwards started in the Korean War. And obviously, there were other very large, very public things that happened as a result of everyone's efforts to advance themselves in nuclear power. So there was also the Marshall Plan. And the plan was actually named for the Secretary of the State at the time. And the purpose of this particular plan was to bring aid to European countries. So as I mentioned, this is after World War II. So Europe is pretty messed up, right? And President Harry Truman signed the Marshall Plan into law in 1948. And part of the Marshall Plan included the formation of NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which was a military alliance between the U.S. and its European allies. And NATO was designed to root out communism. So in addition to the aftermath of World War II, there is a lot of fear about communism. So $15 billion were provided in aid to rebuilding Western Europe, specifically Great Britain, Italy, France, Germany, and Belgium. And also during this time, between 1945 and the 1990s, nuclear testing was being done on U.S. soil. And as I mentioned, specifically, the test site was in Nevada. And there was another one in called the Pacific Ocean Proving Ground, and that's the one located in the Marshall Islands. But for the purpose of this episode, we are staying right here in North America, specifically talking about Nevada. So the Nevada test site, or as it's called, the Nevada Proving Ground, and more formally, the Nevada National Security Site, is located in Nye County, Nevada, and that is 65 miles northwest of Las Vegas. And from July 11th, 1951 until 1992, this was the site of a series of nuclear testing. In fact, there were over 900 nuclear tests performed. And to set the stage a little more, the Nevada Proving Ground includes obviously desert, but also mountainous terrain as well. And the Atomic Energy Commission, or the AEC, was established after World War II, and really was designed to monitor the peacetime development of atomic science. All right. And the purpose of the Nevada test site was to, one, determine the impact of nuclear weapons on like the physical environment, but also on man-made structures like military equipment and buildings. It was also designed for, which sounds like horseshit, but basically another reason for it is that it was supposed to be for like, to figure out if there were possible peaceful uses of these weapons. And if I roll my eyes any harder, I'll go blind. It was also wanting to see, how strong these weapons were and developing new battleground tactics. So in essence, this was all about fighting. This is all about the wars and such. And people in the surrounding communities in Nevada, as well as in Utah, were basically told, hey man, this is totally harmless. Oh my God, look at this giant mushroom cloud. We're trying to keep the borders safe, And so people thought, all right, maybe this isn't so bad. Well, that wasn't true. Okay, so by 1953, there was a growing concern about the exposure to radiation. And testing that was considered non-critical continued after the comprehensive nuclear test ban that was adopted in 1963. And that was so far only adopted by the US and the Soviet Union. But that was, do the math now. So from 1945 until 1963, there was a lot of tests performed and the testing did not stop. So atmospheric nuclear testing stopped in 1962. Underground testing started in 1961, and the last underground test occurred in September of 1992. Okay, so let's very quickly pull the car over. Let's just pull the car right on over. So when we're talking about bombs, right? We're talking about atomic bombs that are made and designed, obviously, for the purpose of combustion, and they are massive, right? And what we should also discuss or bring into this, just for the purposes of helping to understand the scale of these things, is that some of these bombs had more force than Hiroshima. And for those that don't know, the United States, following the attack on Pearl Harbor, dropped bombs over Hiroshima and in Japan, and it completely devastated that area. I mean, I know that there is I can't remember, I'm probably going to blank on the name of the book about the subject, about Hiroshima specifically, so don't quote me, but I would definitely recommend checking that out if you haven't, but I just wanted to mention that before we start really getting into the tests. So I'm going to name some of the major tests that have occurred at the Nevada Proving Ground. This is not all of them, right? And under each operation, there were a series of tests. So even though I'm naming these, I'm going to say Operation Doorstep or whatever, understand that there were several tests within that operation that were all supposed to prove something different. Let's get into it. March 17th, 1953, the Operation Upshot Knothole. Specifically, Upshot Knothole Annie, because they name them. It's so weird, but it's fine. So they name it. So the first test of Operation Knothole was Annie. And this was used to test a 16 kiloton bomb. This was televised. This was on TV. The people could just watch it on TV. And the tests underneath this particular operation continued for 3 months, and there were 11 in total. There was also Operation Doorstep, which was conducted in the same time, around the same time that Operation Upshot Knothole was going on. And this was actually done by the Federal Civil Defense Association. And the goal was to show Americans what it would be like if a nuclear blast occurred and kind of get an idea of how bad like people and houses and cars and stuff would fare in a nuclear explosion. So, I mean, there's tons of pictures of it, and it shows just the damage done to mannequins and the houses, the structures that they built to test this stuff. And I would definitely recommend Googling some of these images because they are horrifying. Next, we have Operation Castle. All right, this occurred in March of 1954, and this operation, we're gonna get into it a little bit more in depth because this is actually the one that occurs in the Marshall Islands. So I'm gonna name this one. We're gonna set that one aside. We'll come back to Operation Castle. Don't you fret. But the following year, in May of 1955, there was Operation Q. And this test was just to test smaller nuclear devices, just to kind of see how they would impact buildings. In May of 1957, Operation Plum Bob. And underneath this particular operation, there were 29 nuclear tests. And this was the longest and most comprehensive test series. And the goal of this was to see if there was a possibility to improve weapon design, some safety testing, some biomedical experiments, and also testing some thermonuclear systems. Oh, yeah. So this test actually accounted for 32% of all civilian atmospheric exposure to cesium-137. Oh, y'all thought, what, it was a new year? We weren't going to talk about this here science? Oh, girl, you got me messed up. So let's get straight into the chemicals. So as I mentioned, we're talking about bombs, right? Not bombs over Baghdad, but there too, right? So for context, we are talking about radioactivity. And what you really should understand without getting all deep into the weeds about it is that they're unstable. These atoms are unstable, right? So they cannot, so like, for example, if you want to think of something that's steady and constant, think of salt, think of water. It's stable, right? It's not shifting or changing around. It might change form, but it is stable enough that it can bond appropriately with other molecules without issue, right? Not the atoms that are emitted as a result of radioactivity. So we're talking about radionuclides, and those are just basically, there's radioactive and unstable atoms with nuclear energy. And the energy that gets emitted, so basically kind of an easy way if you want to think about energy, to me, when I think about an atom being full of energy, I kind of think about it being like a fart, sort of. So like these atoms are basically farting gamma radiation. That's what they're giving off, right? And each time a radio or an unstable radioactive atom emits gamma radiation, this is a part of decay. And so the idea of it is that every time this atom is emitting energy, it's supposed to be decaying or dying, but does a lot of damage in that process. So there's two specific radionuclides that we're going to look at. Not super duper close, but close enough. The first one is cesium-137, as I mentioned. And I also mentioned that that's 32% of all the atmospheric exposure. So another thing that you got to know about nuclear testing as we have this conversation is that nuclear testing occurred in 3 different places. It occurred in the atmosphere, so atmospheric, so bombs going up. It also occurred underground and underwater. Now, the underwater piece is more for Marshall Islands for the purposes of the Nevada Proving Ground. We're talking about atmospheric testing and underground testing. And if you're already thinking about it, because you know how I get down, you know that it doesn't really matter where you do it because it's all going to end up in the soil and the water and the air. Oh my. So cesium-137 is a chemical, and it is present as part of the global fallout from nuclear testing. So fallout, before or when these tests were occurring, there really wasn't fallout was not the term that was used to describe what occurred when the molecules that are released into the atmosphere as a result of an atomic bomb going off come back to Earth. That's fallout. So we're talking about this particular chemical, cesium-137, this is part of global fallout. This is all over the damn place. And it causes gamma radiation, and prolonged exposure to gamma radiation causes cancer. No damn surprises. And there was a CDC report that indicates that the presence of this chemical is due to fallout, but it doesn't say that it's necessarily because of the testing at the Nevada testing site. States that have the highest levels of this particular compound are Iowa, North Carolina, Indiana, Idaho, Tennessee, South Dakota. There are more. There are others. Next, joining the party, we have Miss Iodine 131. And this is the most significant radionucleotide that was actually found in the CDC, the Centers for Disease Control, and also the NCI, which is the National Cancer Institute, in their study. It was a feasibility study, basically, which just wanted to see the impact of nuclear testing. And I'm not going to lie to you, because I did read it. It's not, no surprise, it's not that comprehensive. It doesn't really, like I said, it didn't really have the definition of fallout. It does not include all of the activities that are going on globally, because as I mentioned, or I hope I mentioned it, and if I didn't, I'm gonna do it now. The US was not the only person or group participating in nuclear testing. This was like going on in numerous countries around the world. So basically all these countries were just poisoning everybody. Because if you recall, if maybe you don't, we haven't had to use nuclear power, with the exception of Hiroshima. We haven't really had to use nuclear power on anybody, thank God. So iodine 131 causes birth defects, and it impacts the thyroid. And for y'all who are like, what is that? That's the organ in your body that helps you regulate your metabolism. So let's get into, let's talk about this on a global scale. So, I've gone through a few of the tests that occurred, and we're talking a little bit about the global fallout, but let's really get into it. So in the US, there are a group called the downwinders. And these are people that live in Arizona, Nevada, Utah, Oregon, and Idaho, who were all exposed to the after effects of nuclear fallout. In addition to the US, the Soviet Union, Great Britain, China, India, Pakistan, and France were all conducting nuclear tests. However, the US, being the star that it always is, had to do the most. And even though there have been treaties signed to stop nuclear testing, North Korea is not trying to hear all that. And they actually performed the nuclear test a few years ago, back in 2013. So remember that these tests that I'm talking about occurred in the atmosphere and underground. And the underground testing occurred longer than the atmospheric tests. And it's caused seismic or underground changes, as well as contaminating the soil and the aquifers. And if you think back, just very, very, if you can, girl, think on back to the discussions we had about the water cycle and the oxygen cycle. And we know that these cycles are not just occurring over America, they're occurring everywhere. So that means that, as we said, we've already talked about, this is a global impact. In 1986, just for a little bit of history here, in 1986, there's a little nuclear explosion at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant in the Ukraine. And this is where a ton of people died from radiation-induced cancer. And Chernobyl itself became uninhabitable for human beings and was abandoned. The kind of awesome thing about it is that now that area is actually a seat of biodiversity, even though it has very high levels of radiation and is not appropriate for humans to live in. And if you do any research, which I highly recommend, there's a lot of information about Chernobyl. There's infographics that show you exactly what happened. HBO has a really great miniseries about the subject, which, no surprises, your girl watched like 15 times, because I just needed to understand it. I just needed to sit there and just see how you let this thing happen. How? I wanted to know. And if you also want to know, I suggest you watch that. I suggest you watch that limited series. It's very good. Anywho, back here. So fast forwarding very briefly to 1998, Congress asked the CDC to conduct a study on the nuclear weapons testing and the atmosphere. And the CDC and NCI conducted this and determined and defined the term global fallout. Now, note, that's 1998. So even though this testing started in 1945, it was not until 1998 where the term global fallout was properly defined. And unfortunately, and this includes everything except the damn tests that were done at the Nevada testing site, and only includes testing done by Great Britain, the Soviet Union, and what was done at the Pacific Proving Ground, which, as I mentioned, is in the Marshall Islands. And the study only covered testing from 1951 to 1962. So basically, it was just inaccurate as F, right? I'm trying not to swear because I want the kids to listen to this. So basically, it was just a little cute paper girl, but it didn't cover everything the way that it needed to. And fallout, by definition, really describes the ability for particles and gas to travel long distances in the atmosphere before returning to Earth. And as we've talked about, we all know what carries things, particles, atmosphere, is the weather. And that's kind of the point, right? And fallout can cause exposure internally and externally. And externally comes through the air and internally comes through the soil. Oh, because, yeah, we need to get to this too. So you can also ingest radioactive particles through eating plants, milk, meat, all of it. Because if you've got cows on some radioactive soil and you're eating that burger that you got out the McDonald's, radioactivity. Good. All right. So based upon the data, even though it wasn't all that great in this report that I've talked about, it did point to the occurrences and the deaths as a result of global atmospheric testing. And it basically, as I mentioned, it causes thyroid cancer, radioactivity or radiation exposure causes thyroid cancer, leukemia, and other types of cancers. And from 1986 to 1994, no surprises, there were over 500 protests. The girls were not having it, and people were arrested. It was a mess because prior to that, and as I mentioned before, I mean, one of the tests was publicly televised. They let people stand a certain proximity away to watch it. And you saw that giant mushroom cloud. And this was all happening and being told to people that it wasn't bad, that this is no big deal. It's not that bad at all. Come on, just come watch, right? Yeah, killing the girls, killing people. So I think we've come to the crossroads, right? So let's get back to this essay that I mentioned by Lorena Russell. So the 2006 remake of the film, The Hills Have Eyes, at the start gives the statistics regarding nuclear testing in the U.S. And as a result, if you decide to watch this movie, if you've already seen it, you know already what you're in for. You know this is a horror movie, and now you get this piece of information, and you're getting the stage set for you. And immediately, the audience is going to see the impact and the aftermath of this testing through this family that's living in the hills or living in the desert. And Russell describes this movie as the depiction of state-sponsored violence. And where have we heard that term before? Well, we heard it and saw it last year and in previous years in response to the protests, in response to police brutality. State-sponsored violence. And the reason that I bring this particular essay into the conversation is not just because I am a total horror buff and I love it, and any opportunity I can find to bring all these things together, I will take it, but also because horror is a great way for those of us who watch it and those of us who write it and create it to express difficult and traumatic emotions and feelings. And the Hills Have Eyes, we see this very affluent white family, the Carters, in no way relations to the real Carters. You know who I'm talking about. And they make a wrong turn and come face to face with their exact opposites. This family who is poor and wild and cannibals because they're living in the middle of nowhere and it's not like there's a Whole Foods down the street. And so as a result, this family, because they made the wrong turn, end up coming face to face with their polar opposite and worst possible nightmare. And in this particular essay, Lorena actually notes that the film is an example of military and government interests overriding the needs and the well-being of country or rural communities. And films like The Hills Have Eyes, and for those of you who get down, you might have watched Deliverance, and hell, even if you've seen Alien or Aliens, or you're into the Alien universe, these are all examples of extractive economies. And extraction is through digging or burning and exploitation of resources and labor for the purposes of enclosing wealth and power and to have governance over it. So Russell associates the law, the state of the enforcement of state violence with the repressive and ideological measures. And repressive measures include policing and military enforcement of law. And ideological measures refers to the ideas and social-based institutions like family, like churches and schools. And both of these still function to uphold the interests of the ruling class. So The Hills Have Eyes calls difference in class into question, and the idea of who is violent and possibly why. And the misconception of who is violent and why can be traced back to the conditions of the person's environment. And it's important to note, right, that the US and other countries we never came to blows. Like, it never came to the point where we needed to go rain down hellfire over the Soviet Union, right? And unfortunately, and even through my research, not just about the Nevada Proving Ground, where there's a lot of information, but also a lot of information that I found in researching the Marshall Islands as well, that it's a lot of misinformation out there. And the full impact has really not been discovered and not really fully been tapped. And it's been left up to, private researchers and other activists to do that work, right? To really get an adequate picture of what's going on or what's going wrong. So let's bring it on home. So we've talked about this essay. I've talked about state-sponsored violence, and I want to go back really quickly just to say that when I talk about state-sponsored violence, I'm talking about the nuclear testing, because performing these tests didn't do jack shit but poison people and give them cancer. That's literally it. And it hasn't gone anywhere. There's still issues as far as the impact in the soil, the impact in the water, because all these things are just recycled, right? Recycled through our weather cycles, through our the weather patterns all over the world. Okay, so that's depressing, right? All right. Well, let's talk about some of the solutions, and let's talk about some folks who are actually doing the work. So we have, thankfully, phytoremediation. And this is a term that was coined back in the 1990s. And it really was coined to classify the resilience in Chernobyl, in the city of Chernobyl, in the aftermath of the explosion that occurred in 1986. And scientists were testing to see hemp, actually, if hemp and its ability to accumulate heavy metals in the soil. And much of Chernobyl has been reclaimed by plants, which is great, because as we know, the more plants we have, we can absorb more of the carbon dioxide and other heavy metals as well in the soil. And phytoremediation really it absorbs. This is the process of absorbing those metals and releasing less harmful byproducts due to transpiration. When plants release absorbed water into the soil, when plants release absorbed water in the soil as water vapor into the atmosphere. So phytoremediation is a long process and it can take some time, but it is considered to be cost effective and low risk. And it has been used by the EPA, and actually for some homegrown flavor, they've employed this tactic at the Aberdeen Proving Ground, which happens to be in the state of Maryland. And a federal bill was introduced last year, which is being called the Downwinder Parity Act. And this is an amendment to the Radiation Exposure Compensation Act that was passed in 1990, and the purpose of this, the Downsiders Parity Act, is really to add more funds to claimants. So of course, no surprises, even though the U.S. did the best they could try to cover this shit up, people sued and wanted to be compensated. There had to be some compensation for folks who were exposed to radiation, because they were, and that's what the Radiation Exposure Compensation Act is. And the request is to extend and increase the size of the funding. I know that was depressing. I said I was coming back. I didn't say I was going to not freak you out. But this is important information. This is something that's still ongoing, that we still have to combat with, and we have to contend with, that we have all been, unfortunately, exposed to radiation. Yay! I mean, it's not bad, right? It's just cancer and your skin fall off. In the next episode, I'm going to be covering the Marshall Islands, as I have been alluding to you for the last 30 minutes. And I wanted to set this stage, and I wanted to do this particular episode because it's a lot of things that I am very passionate about, which are horror movies. I love them. I love the message that you're allowed to come out with, and it gives an example, or gives folks a time to be scared, to feel their feelings, but know that it's not real and it's not going to harm them. And if you think horror movies are stupid, which I hope not, girl. I mean, my God. But, if it's not your bag, I understand it. But understanding also that there's a lot there's a ways to discuss trauma through the images that we see in horror. And actually, going back to Tananarive Due, one thing that she says very eloquently is Black history is Black horror. And we can see that even as in this discussion of The Hills Have Eyes. I mean, the first thing that I think about, honestly, is Us, Jordan Peele's film, which is one of my personal favorites. Here is this affluent family, at their summer home, getting confronted by their doppelgangers, people who look exactly like them, but are living a completely disparate life, right? It's completely separate from the kind of life that the family in their summer home are living. And really it calls into question, what you would do to survive. I mean, going back to The Hills Have Eyes, I mean, they had to get down. They got to kill. You got to murder, kill, girl, if you want to get out alive. And for a lot of people, that's what real life looks like. That's what real life can be like. I know, it's dark. But anyhow, I hope you enjoyed this information. I hope this makes you sound like a real genius at the next party you go to on Zoom. Real quick. And I said I wasn't going to talk. Well, no, I didn't. I didn't make any promises about this. I said I was going to talk about this a little bit more on Twitter. And I'm just going to address it real quick because, it's my show. So I, like the rest of you, have been wholly cackling at the parodies that you guys made of the crazy white people who stormed the Capitol. And some of the one that crying ass white woman talking about she wanted to storm the Capitol for a revolution. Let's talk about that. Besides the obvious things that people have been saying, like, wanting to talk about what side all these people were on and if they were terrorists or rioters or if they were just angry citizens. Let me just tell you something. For those who think that this is not what America stands for, I want you to know this is exactly what America stands for, and specifically white America. And For you white people, God bless y'all if y'all actually listen to me. But if you do, I got a quick word for y'all too. The only reason that you guys weren't out there too is because you haven't had your whole card peeped yet. See, the people that were outside in the streets, they think that something was stolen from them. They think something was taken from them. They think that their rights, their freedoms, their liberties, whatever that's supposed to mean to them, were taken away, right? And so their response is to loot and to riot. And that's period. That's what they did. They broke into a building that has not apparently been breached since 1812 because they're mad and deep in their feels because Cheeto Von Ass Clown did not get elected for 4 more years of that fuck shit. Right? So while the whites who listen to me or who think that this doesn't apply to them and want to separate themselves, oh no, girl, these are your people. These are yours. This is your peeps. You don't get to deny them and separate yourself because you all are all the same. You all will all do this. And in fact, you do it. You may not riot. You may not storm the Capitol, but you damn sure will badmouth your black or brown coworker. You'll damn sure talk about that person behind their back, intentionally misspell their name, but straight up can pronounce Targaryen and spell it and brag about speaking Elfish. Oh yeah, but y'all will mess up a person's name in a heartbeat and want them to give you a nickname. You'll make microaggressions and make comments like, you don't watch The Oval? and other things to try to make a person of color feel bad about what they choose to do. So you're not out there in the streets yet because your card hasn't been pulled. Because not yet has the impacts and the actual resilience of the people affected you yet. So let me talk about that real quick. So without spilling too much of my personal tea, because I try to keep my life real personal, girl. But basically, I'm an educated black woman, right? In case y'all ain't know. And I know what that gives. I know the vibe that gives. I know to an insecure person, I'm your worst nightmare. Because not only can you tell that I'm 100% qualified to be in the room, you can also tell that I'm with the shit. That I have no problems telling you about yourself. And someone like me is a threat to an insecure person who's had their whole life handed to them. And yeah, I'm getting straight to it. So the reason that you guys are not out on the street right now is because someone like me hasn't taken your job from you, girl, taken that promotion that you thought was yours. Because someone like me is not living next to you in the house that you thought you were going to have some other white person living in the house next to you. Because I pull up next to you and I've got the nicest car. See, that hasn't happened to you yet. You haven't had to lose yet. So it's okay because you still think you're fighting Goliath. See, the problem with y'all liberal whites, y'all very safe cush whites with your money and your resources is you haven't had that pulled yet. You haven't had to actually be in real competition and recognize that you can't win. And the minute that happens is the minute your Birkenstock wearing, Volvo driving, old ponytail, goddamn flannel shirt, skinny jeans, tattooed man bun, that's when all y'all will be in the streets. Because let me tell you something, and I know, and I'm not trying to get all metaphysical, I'm gonna just do it real quick. See, so we're in the age of Aquarius now. All that 400 years, we've passed that time now, and we coming. I don't know if y'all, let me just give you a little insight. People like me are not playing with you. We're not playing. We're not gonna be cute. We're not gonna keep it cute any longer. We want what's ours. The Native Americans want what's theirs. Asian folk want what's theirs, and they are coming. And there ain't shit you can do to stop it, girl, because y'all ain't prepared. You're not built for this. But that's all right. But understand, black folks and other people of color who are listening to this, and I'll even give y'all, some of y'all allies, I'll give y'all a little bit too, but very little, until you really show up and prove to me. Because I already know, because you've been able to insulate yourselves in power. You've been able to insulate yourselves in wealth. So you haven't had to be exposed. But the minute that you got someone, you got more people of color living around you, and you have to listen to Hector Lavoe and Lil Boosie all night, you'll have some other things to say. Y'all will be in the streets too. The minute that you get to watch that black person come in and let have poised together on top of their shit, you'll be in the streets too, because you've never really had to compete, girl. And it's hard to compete where you don't compare. And that's all I'm going to say. You know, I've seen the commentary. Shout out to Joy Reid. I know she definitely gave people a sermon. I know everybody's out here. And just real quick, this whole narrative that's going around that this is not America, that's bullshit. This is absolutely America. This is exactly what the Boston Tea Party. Come on now. And they try to make it sound like people were just doing the cha-cha slide with the boxes of tea and just punting them shits in the... No. They were having a tantrum. That riot at the damn Capitol, that is a tantrum. And they're going to keep doing it because they think that this country is theirs. It's all right. It is all right. Anyway, I just want to thank you all coming for, I just want to really thank you guys for coming to another episode of The Crossroads. I'm back, obviously. That's it. That's all. That's it. And that's all. I'm not going to do no more. I'm not going to say no more. I'm not going to do it. But just let me tell you one more thing. And mostly I just want to say this, like, to all the black folks out there who listen to me and who maybe, no matter where you are or what you're doing with your life, I want you to know that you are divinely supported. I want you to know that no matter what it looks like, you are your ancestors' wildest dreams. Don't ever get it fucked up. And don't let anybody get you fucked up. If they always know who you are and always read your contracts. Tell them people to try Jesus and not you. All right. And that concludes this episode. And I will see you all at the crossroads.